brings tears to my eyes. I don't know if it does to yours. I'm going to do a slight change. And I hope that I'm going to do a slight change in the service, and we'll get a report in a moment. Warren, will you let us know how things are? I'm going to do a slight change in the service. If the choir and the organist and Charles won't mind, I'd like to close with that today because it'll fit very nicely with where I intended for the sermon to go. And so after I get through preaching, I'm going to go back to the back and read the church covenant. And when I finish reading the church covenant, while we're in a period of meditation, I'm going to ask for again the singing of the reverse Lord's Prayer. And I hope you'll listen not only to the beauty of the music, but to the words. You'll probably find some very interesting and different interpretations to the Lord's Prayer at that particular point. Nope. That'll be the conclusion, right then and there. And that'll be an outstanding conclusion for where we want to go. Sorry. After all of our prayers and loving concern, we passed over the fact that Marilyn shoots back and feeling better. And I'm delighted to see her, and I know you are. She's been through a long, difficult time, and Marilyn, nice to have you here. Lauren has given you a brief idea of something of the background of this church. This church has always been a church which required a tremendous impact and input of its membership. It is not a church of leaders. It's a church of workers and doers. It doesn't mean that leaders aren't workers and doers, but it does mean that we have an obligation, each one of us as members of this church, to recognize that the 16-year history has been a history in which we as individuals have worked together. The strength of the congregation has been, is, and in this church always will be, not the individuals who accept a certain position in the church, nor indeed the clergy, the pastor, the minister, but is the individual. You sitting in the pew. And that's the most important part. As I've been talking for the past few weeks on the ideas of the wisdom literature, we've been talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. He gave some advice, this wisdom writer, about religious observances. I'd like to read those now from the 5th chapter. Be circumspect when you go to the house of God. Approach in order to learn, rather than to offer sacrifice like that of fools who know nothing except how to do wrong. At the time in which he was writing, the temples of the world were places of sacrifice. And you went, and your main religious obligation was to offer up sacrifice unto God, whether it be the small doves or the larger animals. But already this religious writer recognized that sacrifice in itself did very little to change the inner being of the human spirit. For there are many even in this day who go to offer sacrifice weeping and wailing and shouting and beating their breast, but at the same time failing to know that what is really important is that one approaches the house of God in order to learn. Indeed, as we said last week, religion is primarily a means of helping an individual to live with himself. Do not speak impetuously, nor think of uttering a hurried word before God. Since God is in heaven and you are on earth, let your words be few. How many of us have joined or done things and let it just flow out? How many people pass through the halls of any church anywhere, pledging their support, giving their honor, willing to work until the ceremonies are all over and then suddenly disappear? A dream follows on much busyness, and a fool's speech on too much talk. When you make a vow to God, do not be slow in paying for it, for he has no liking for fools. Pay what you vow to pay. It is better that you make no vow than that you make a vow and fail to keep it. Do not allow your tongue to put you in the wrong, and do not say to the messenger who comes to collect it, it was just a mistake. Why should God be angered by your speech and destroy what you have accomplished? Like so many empty dreams or so many empty words, simply show respect to God. The ancient world was fully aware of the importance of the word. We've lost that in today's world. We produce more words in a single day than the ancient world did in all of its history. We hear more words in a single day than the ancient world did in all of its history, between radio and television and books and newspapers and newscasters. Words fly on and on and on and on and on with almost no real understanding of the impact or the concern of the words themselves. If you've listened to sports broadcasting recently, you're recognizing that they're giving all kinds of quick things. Are we okay? Okay. Mary Souter for many of you, and thank you. Words themselves are thrown out with no concept of the impact and the validity and the truthfulness of that particular word. We say things and do things without ever asking, what is it all about? And why do we do it? For example, in the ancient world, one did not utter a word that he was not responsible for. Mr. Butts and a few others ought to be aware in the contemporary world of that. Jacob and Esau is a famous story. Jacob did not have a right to the inheritance of his father under Esau, but he made a little trick with the help of his mother. You remember the story. Esau was an hairy man. I always loved that phrase. An hairy man. And as a hairy man, he had a deep voice, was a hunter and out doing all kinds of things. Jacob was a poet, more or less, and did not have the hair, did not have the depth of voice, did not have the same kind of physical characteristics. And his father in old age, going blind, came time to give the blessing. And Jacob's mother said, let us go in. And they took some wool from a sheep, he must indeed have been an hairy man, and put it on his hands and on the back of his neck. And they went in for the blessing. Father reached out and touched the back of the neck and felt the hair and reached out and touched the hands. And he said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he gave the blessing. Now Esau came in. And you would think that a blessing given could be taken back when it had been given under false pretenses. But the ancient world knew that once a word had been spoken, it could not be brought back. Another blessing could be given, but there was no magic eraser. I'm sorry. No, the contract is invalid. No, there was a failure to read your rights that could erase what had already been said. For the word had a life in its own. Sometimes in our contemporary world, I wish we understood that when I say things to people, no matter what I may be thinking about them, they can hurt deeply, even though the intention wasn't there, and I should indeed be more careful of my speech. How many times have you hurt and been hurt by people who have trod upon your very soul by saying things, even if they may not have meant to hurt you, assuming that it was always, quote, a joke? I'm only kidding is another way of saying I'm sorry, which is another way of saying, well, it got to you, didn't it? And you learned your lesson. The evil of words that penetrate and dig and hurt and grovel down inside us is something the ancients knew and we basically didn't know. But on the other hand, we have not only the fact that words themselves, once spoken, cannot be taken back or erased, but we have in the contemporary understanding of life the fact that words don't mean anything at all. We saw last Friday night George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman. I'm a great fan of Shaw's. I've always misunderstood him until this morning. I think for the first time I'm beginning to understand George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw is the great iconoclast. I recommend you go see it. It's a fantastic play set in London in 1905, written about that time, holding up all of English society and American society, the wealthy American society, and all the games that the people were playing back and forth and talking about love and marriage and all of those kinds of things. George Bernard Shaw is the great iconoclast. We all say the one thing about George Bernard Shaw is that nothing to him was sacred. I always held that to be true until this very morning driving down here thinking about that play in this sermon. That is absolutely false. Please correct me, all of you fans of Shaw, if I'm not right on this. Shaw did not ever in his life hold up everything to ridicule. The difference is that Shaw held everything sacred except hypocrisy. Love and marriage and church and country and all those things for Shaw were so sacred that when you study and look at what he's doing, he holds up not the institution as being wrong, but the hypocrisies that we strut and pile on top of the institution. He's unhappy with the mothers who manipulate for their children, particularly their daughters, who force them into molds because that's what they think they ought to be doing, who use lying words to trip up others. He's unhappy with clergymen who give out all of the pat phrases with none of the heart or the existence or the soul feeling about it. He's extremely unhappy with government officials who can stand up and over again repeat things without having the slightest intention of following through on them. He is not an iconoclast against institutions. He's against the hypocrisy that goes into the institutions. And he's an individual who holds up the fact that words do matter, and when we say something, we ought to be responsible for what we say and have good intentions. Am I right about Shaw? When you really get down to it? Isn't that what he's after? What he wants those of us in the church to be are honest with ourselves, not pious hypocrites. He wants a yes to be a yes and a nay to be a nay in the biblical sense. Not a yes to be a maybe, a no, or anything I want it to be when I want it to be. Think back over this week with that understanding in mind and what is going on in the political scene with so-called debates. God help us. That is the most exasperating and fundamentally upsetting thing I've seen in a long time, the recent two, quote, debates. I don't like debates, number one. Debates ultimately do nothing except show off the skill of an individual. They don't get to the heart of a problem. Traditionally, the purpose of debates was to show all sides of a particular issue, and then you would make your own decision. That's the traditional point of a debate. But it immediately gets down to the cleverness and all to manipulate your audience to believe something, whether you believe it or not. The debater does not have a moral commitment to what he's debating. The better the debater you are, the more you don't have the moral commitment. You can take any side of an issue and make it sound good. Now, the women's voters, the League of Women's Voters, said the purpose of these debates is that people will understand the issues, right? Now, when you understand issues, you're seeking understanding. You can't walk out and immediately ask who won. If the purpose is understanding, there is no winning. It shows what I mean. The purpose of the debates are not in any manner of mainstream to form an effort to understand issues, but to con us into supporting one or the other. That's why we talk about who won or who didn't win, and who scored points and who didn't score points, right? Huh? Well, the media, and they are too. Because if the issues were important, you wouldn't hire Hollywood people to come in and teach you how to say things, a la Mr. Ford. You would not have lighting experts coming in and working to get exactly the right lighting to make you come off. The issue doesn't depend on the lighting. You wouldn't have all kinds of rules and regulations about what you can wear and what size stool and what you can do and what you can't do. And you wouldn't have all kinds of artificial cut-off times. If an issue is to really be discussed, you can't do it in 2 minutes or 5 minutes and suddenly say, I'm sorry, you've had your time. It's not only the media, it's the fact that we really don't want to deal with issues. We want personalities that look good. And those who are committed to one candidate or the other basically are committed afterwards and excuse the mistakes. And those who aren't committed to one or the other aren't going to be changed at all. But what issues were discussed last Thursday or the week before? You can remember the statements that Mr. Ford made about the racial groups and the countries in Eastern Europe, because that caused a great furor. But you remember what he said about Korea? Not really. That was one of the minor points that came out and part of the political game. And isn't it interesting that there's so much effort being put in that you don't know what Mr. Ford or Mr. Carter think, you only know what their advisors tell them to say because of the impact. The impact. The impact of this word, or this phrase, or this sound, or this look, or this lighting, or what have you. George Bernard Shaw would have had a field day with these debates. He would have absolutely had a field day because he would have held out to us with the beautiful understanding that words are not relevant, but that we are seduced by words into believing that they are. I love you is the most oft-repeated phrase in the world and one of the least understood. Ask anybody what they mean by it, and they start to sputter, and all kinds of things come out, and they're always caught by telling you what they want you to believe they mean and trying to be honest at the same time. It's manipulation. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O God. And the honest individual is one whose words of the mouth and the meditations of the heart are at one. The problem with lying is you're always caught with it because you can't remember when you lied and when you didn't lie. The person who is open and honest and able to react doesn't have that kind of a problem. So I think as we begin to understand the scripture of the day, we ought to recognize that we are not dealing with the seduction of words, but rather dealing with an honest approach. Let your aye be an aye and your nay a nay. And if you can't make it one or the other, don't make a statement at all. Fair enough? Okay, very quickly. And the second point. The word, the commitment that goes with the word is in biblical language a covenant, a contract. I can remember a few years ago when working in Wayne State University, we built a religious center. And in the course of building a religious center, several $1 million were passing through my hands. It's sort of a strange feeling. After a while, they say you get used to it. I never did. Little checks like this, you know. Letter came one day in one of those typical plain envelopes that most obscene mail arrives in, you know, down at the office, and there was just a little post office box and my name on it. And I looked like this, and I threw it over on the pile of junk on my desk, which there's always a pile of, and about 6 or 8 days later, decided to clean my desk, and I'm going through mail like this. And usually that's the kind of mail that I don't even bother to open. And something caught. I said, oh, I guess I better open this one. And I slit the thing open, and out fell a check for $75,000. And I sat there with my knees sort of like this, and I looked at that basket. $75,000 almost thrown in. Since that time, I open every letter. I don't always read them. It's the only time in my life that a check like that ever came. It wasn't for me. It was for the building. It was a part of a payment. But can you believe a check for $75,000 in a plain envelope? Easy come, easy go. Right. In the biblical world, a commitment is a covenant relationship. During the time we were building this, there were all kinds of contracts being entered into. Now, I am not a lawyer, nor am I the son of a lawyer. I don't understand legal process and one little bit, to be honest with you. I do not know what it means to be a lawyer. But I was reading all these contracts, and finally one major contract was to be signed. And here was the attorney for the university and the attorney for the religious center, and me in between him representing both. That's what Karen Cook feels like when she's selling a house. Now, how do you sell? That's the most squeezed position in the world. You've got two clients, the buyer and the seller. And you're trying to keep them both happy, and they're both squeezing on you, right, Karen? Man, is that tough. It'd be much better to have one and somebody else representing the other. But somehow in a real estate business, that's the one in the middle. And there I was, trying to keep them both happy. I read the contract and I said in exasperation, my God, I'm not a lawyer, but I could break that contract. And both of them roared. And they said, Jim, you are naive. There is no contract in the world that can't be broken. The purpose of a contract is merely good intentions. We both know that contract can be broken. And we both know we may have to do it sometime. What happened to the idea when you said yes, you meant yes? What happened to the idea that when somebody said, I'll do it, you knew that they were going to do it? What happened to the idea that if somebody said, no, I can't, they meant it? This idea of constantly having to battle and to talk people into doing things and to manipulate is absolutely abhorrent to me. And you know instinctively there are still individuals around that if you hand them a $5 bill, you want a receipt. And you also know instinctively there are individuals around you could hand them $100,000 or $1 million and you wouldn't need a receipt. Because there are warm human beings that you could sit down and you know that if they said yes, they meant it, and they would do everything in their power to carry it through. It's a covenant. It's a commitment. And the kingdom of God on earth, as we try to work it out, is a covenant and a commitment. God pledges to do certain things for us, and we pledge to do certain things from Him. And that's the excitement of it. For as God works through us, we have an understanding. Well, geez, it's getting late. Talk about that for a long time. But ultimately, what is this church? Legally, it's an institution. It's a non-profit organization. We've got all kinds of papers to show it. Phony. Fulfills the letter of the law, doesn't mean a thing. This church can exist if all of us went away, according to those papers. What is this church? It's a church of covenant people. It is a church of committed people who are committed by their very being and existence to two things: God and themselves and one another. They enter into covenant one with the other. They pledge support one with the other. And they say, let your aye be an aye and your nay a nay. It's tragic to read over the list of those who have signed the original covenant. And every member of this church pledged in a ceremony to support that covenant. There are people on there who have passed away. God be with them. They were faithful and loyal servants. There are people who, for one reason or another, have been transferred and moved away. Children who have grown up and gotten married and are no longer in the area. God be with them. We send them out with our loving grace. But there are also people on there who just don't care anymore. Their commitment was not a commitment for time and lasting and valid. It was a commitment of the moment. And when things didn't quite suit them, they dropped to one side or the other with all kinds of excuses. Those are the individuals we need to reach out with love and say, hey, let your yea be a yea and your nay a nay. For we, as loving people, ought to be honest with one another. So on the 16th anniversary Sunday, where we've been is important, where we're going is important, but where we are now is the most significant thing. I love thinking over the past and looking at the pictures, and I hope some of you are adding them downstairs on the bulletin board. Over the next few weeks, let's keep bringing them in. It's fun. It's fun to see people as they were and as they gathered and as they helped us to be. It's fun to think about all of the hard work that's gone into this church. And I can look over and point to face after person who have poured themselves into this church. I personally am grateful. But you know what? That doesn't help us a bit today and tomorrow to do what we ought to be doing. Our 16th anniversary is significant, but it's only significant if it pledges us and rededicates us to reach towards the years to come. If it gives us the drive to honestly work out the questions and the problems, if it enables us to continue struggling to love one another and to support one another, if it gives us the strength to overcome that in our own lives which is so difficult, and in overcoming to help others to share with it, then it's significant. 16th anniversary, fine. 17th, fine. But what are we going to do in between? So I'm going to ask, for just a moment, we pause. I want you to think about it. I want you at this particular point to understand your relationship to God, your relationship to each other, your relationship to this church. And whether you be a guest or a visitor or whether you be a member isn't important at this point, because the questions are far broader than a Pine Hill Congregational Church. And then while we have the period of meditation, I'm going to pass to the back of the church and read for us all the covenant that each of you as members pledge, including myself. In that period of meditation, I think, again, if we listen to the Lord's Prayer as it's been sung, it will not only give us the faithfulness to continue with strength, the joy and the happiness to know we can do it. Shall we pause for a moment of prayer?